Welcome back. We're unpacking the COVID impacts on learning, and maybe there were issues prior to COVID, but definitely things seem to get exacerbated during that point. And joining me to have that discussion and share her research is Paige Macpherson. She's with the Frasier Institute. So, Paige, just before we cut to commercial break, we were discussing the yo-yoing and I guess the asymmetric policies across this country, province to province, territory to territory, that some, for example, BC, they only had 10 weeks of closures, and then some forms perhaps of learning, whereas in Ontario, there was upwards of 27 weeks. You do mention those were the lockdowns, but you're right. There was times when kids had to be masked at school or were forced to stay home. So things really could have spiraled into almost, even for some families, a full year. But during that time, kids were trying to learn. They were learning at home. Parents were given iPads in some cases, and there were laptops, and children were taught to do synchronous learning. Did that help soften the bite, if you will?
Well, I think that certainly it was better than nothing. Some kids continued learning. It really depends on the child. I think that it's actually fair to say that there might have been some children who actually did better learning from home. I know anecdotally that there are some families who actually stuck with homeschooling after they tried virtual learning during COVID policy times. And so certainly, I mean, that worked well, having that kind of direct parent instruction, particularly if their parent wasn't also trying to work full time at the same time, working from home, and could be there to help support their kids' learning. So that there was definitely some of that. But then on the flip side, there were parents who worked in jobs that, the grocery stores didn't close. If your mom worked at a grocery store, she had to go in. If they worked in healthcare, there was lots of examples of parents who were not reliably at home to help support their kids. And there were also kids who probably needed the routine and supports that are available at school. And as such, I think that's one of the reasons why we can see that increased inequality is likely one of the outcomes of these COVID-19 school closures. There's research from the US and other countries, and there's actually research from Quebec looking at grade 4 students in reading that showed that students who were already struggling were much worse off following school closures. They were much more directly impacted negatively in terms of their learning and student achievement outcomes than were students who were doing okay going in. Now, there were impacts across the board. School closures were not good by and large for most students, but certainly there were some demographics that were hit harder. And that's a really tragic outcome to see that kind of increased inequality, because that's something that I think, as a country or at the provincial level, we try to increase the outcomes and lift. Rising tide lifts all boats, try to help all kids. And so to see that some kids are more directly impacted by the school closures, I think is a really tragic outcome. It's another way that we see this is in increased student absenteeism, which is just that a student is out of school more than they're in school. And we've seen this we've seen it in Europe, in the UK, in the US. There's some Ontario data as well showing that the number of students who actually are just not showing up for school, who have disappeared altogether from the system, has increased following school closures, and that's a very tragic outcome as well.
So if I understand what you've just said correctly, that COVID sort of, I don't know, for lack of a better phrase, set an example of, oh, this is what being away from school feels like, and some children just simply haven't returned. There's an increase in absenteeism.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There are some kids who have basically disappeared from the education system altogether. And that was always a factor that always has happened, of course, pre-COVID, but school closures actually worsened that. And what's interesting in some of the data from the UK and the US is that it's actually been worsened in subsequent years that they've looked at. So it was worse in 2021 than it was in 2020, worse in 2022 than it was in 2021. So this is
Wow.
actually a compounding impact.
My goodness. And does this increase in absenteeism, the lower outcomes educationally, when you say there's inequality, does this cut across socioeconomic lines?
Yes, that's exactly right. So, and this is something that will emphasize. It's not that this should have been shocking to any of the government policymakers who imposed school closures on kids. We know that lost classroom time impacts kids who are struggling more than kids who are doing well. And the World Bank data that you referenced early on, talking about the reduced lifetime earnings and the tens of thousands and the global economic toll in the trillions of these school closures, that World Bank research also estimated that a much greater toll on girls, minorities, and disabled children than on others. So certainly this is
Right.
something that class lines, it's different. Yes, it basically impacts more vulnerable communities
Okay, I'm
to a
going to cut
greater
you
degree.
there. We're going to go through that data in just a few moments.